Hello and welcome to Psych Reads. My name is Gina. I'm going to be reading through the book entitled Letters to a Young Therapist by Mary Pipher. This is the revised edition published in 2016. In this video, I'll be introducing the book by reading the summary on the back of the book, the preface to the 2016 edition, and the introduction. The back summary. Mary Pipher's groundbreaking investigation of America's girl poisoning culture reviving Ophelia established its author as one of the nation's foremost authorities on family issues. In Letters to a Young Therapist, Pipher shares what she has learned in 30 years of clinical practice helping warring families, alienated adolescents, and harried professionals restore peace and beauty to their lives. Through an exhilarating mix of storytelling and sharp-eyed observation, Pipher reveals her refreshingly inventive approach to therapy, fiercely optimistic, free of dogma or psychobabble, and laced with generous warmth and practical common sense. Whether she's recommending daily swims for a sluggish teenager, encouraging a timid husband to become bolder, or simply bearing witness to a bereaved parent's sorrow, Pipher's compassion and insight shine from every page. Newly updated with a preface by the author addressing the changes in therapy over the last decade and the surprising challenges of the digital age, Letters to a Young Therapist is a powerfully engaging guide to living a healthy life. A bit about the author. Mary Pipher is the author of 9 books, including the bestsellers The Shelter of Each Other, Another Country, and the landmark Reviving Ophelia, Saving the Selves of Adolescent Girls, which spent 154 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and has been translated into 19 languages. Pipher has traveled all over the world lecturing to students, healthcare professionals, and community groups. She lives in Lincoln, Nebraska. Letters to a Young Therapist. Preface to the 2016 edition. Dear Reader, upon examining Letters to a Young Therapist 12 years after it was originally published, I found myself happily surprised by it. I discovered a few mistakes to correct, but overall I stand by the original version of the book. Much of what I said about being a therapist seems pretty timeless. Human beings have essentially the same needs and desires as they have had for 10,000 years. We all want to be understood, respected, and loved. We want to be happy and useful. And no matter how lucky our lives look to others, we all suffer. Of course, people are heavily influenced by the cultures in which they live, and our culture has changed in significant ways over the past 12 years. People are more worried about money now than they were in 2003. Student debt is higher. College graduates in the humanities and social sciences are having a harder time finding work, and over 50% of all American school children live below the poverty line. New technologies have introduced more complexity and intensity into the lives of ordinary citizens. When I am in public places such as student unions, coffee shops, or city parks, almost everyone is peering into an electronic device. We are plugged in constantly to machines that keep us multitasking, scattered, hurried, and on the clock. For perhaps the first time in human history, most of our interactions with others do not involve being together. We may be in constant contact with our friends and family through one medium or another, but that contact often means fewer chances to see their faces or offer them a kind touch. Our intensely networked lives also mean that we are constantly reminded by one source or another that the world is filled with danger, evil, and urgent crises. We are bombarded by too much information, too many choices, and too much complexity. Our mammalian arousal systems, Neolithic brains, and medieval institutions have yet to adapt to the dizzying pace of 21st century technology and communications. It is a struggle to relax and slow down. Contemporary culture is making us all a little crazy. Our fears have made us more vulnerable to addictions, compulsions, lethargy, and anxiety attacks. Many of us shop, eat, and medicate to numb ourselves to the pain of the world. Our bodies are tense, and our sleep is troubled. We leave a great deal of our experience unprocessed and unspoken. We find it more difficult to be integrated, vibrant people. We tend to view what I would call culturally created illnesses as something that resides inside the client. This can have us pathologizing what is a normal response to trauma. For example, anxiety about the future seems quite realistic given the world we are living in. Recently, my dentist told me that for most of the 30 years she has been practicing, about a fifth of her patients had trouble with grinding their teeth. Now she said the percentages are suddenly much higher, and even people who have not historically had these problems now do. She and I agreed that this is probably a symptom of our stressful times. When we interact with clients today, it's important to keep all of the pressures of our time and place in mind. Clients need to see their personal problems in this larger context. We can ask them questions about how they filter information flow, how they relax after hearing about traumatic events, and what keeps them grounded in a very turbulent culture where every day they receive more unsettling news about human suffering. We can suggest ways for them to connect with deep time and the beauty that is always around all of us. Our field has made some big improvements in this new century. We now have much better protocols and research backed treatments for couples, clients with borderline personalities, trauma victims, and people with obsessive compulsive disorder. And we have a better understanding of how the brain works. Psychotherapists have adopted a great many techniques from the mindfulness movement. Yoga, meditation, and other practices that focus on breathing and the body have helped both therapists and clients slow down and feel more connected to the present moment. But our profession also faces new problems. The essence of therapy remains the sanctity of the relationship between therapist and client. A person sits down with another person in a quiet, protected place, and they jointly explore their relationship and the client's situation. All of the structure, privacy, time to truly explore thoughts and feelings, careful attention to the discussion, and an absence of distractions that has historically protected therapy is what has made the relationship meaningful and unique. Until recently, therapists and clients knew almost nothing about each other before meeting in the therapy room. Now, with Facebook, blogs, websites, texting, and email, machines can mediate much of the contact between people participating in therapy. This changes the nature of the relationship. Therapeutic interventions via email or text messages are not the same as those that come from careful conversations in protected space and time. Payment issues are also compromising. In order to reimburse for therapy, insurance companies require a great deal of evidence that a client has significant mental health problems. This means that therapists need to share confidential information with insurance companies just so that clients can afford to see them. Neither the clients nor the therapist can possibly know where all of this information goes or how long it stays around. Insurance companies also require a clinical diagnosis. This was true during most of my practice, but I could use a now non existent diagnosis, adjustment reaction to adult life. That covered almost everything. But oftentimes, the people who come to our offices are merely experiencing the common crises of everyday life. Children in therapy are especially likely to be experiencing either family or school difficulties or normal developmental challenges. Yet, when they are diagnosed, they are often saddled with pathological labels that stay with them for years. Our profession has not always been protective enough of our clients' needs for clean records and privacy. Since the publication of Letters to a Young Therapist in 2003, more physicians and therapists are using medications as part of mental health treatment. Drug companies can now advertise psychoactive pharmaceuticals on television, and many clients ask for and expect a pill to help them with their problems. Likewise, physicians are encouraged by Big Pharma to offer medications for depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, and hyperactivity. The increase in medications being prescribed to children is especially alarming. Young children today are often given diagnoses such as bipolar and ADHD and medicated accordingly. Oftentimes, these medications are not necessary. In fact, frequently, children's problems can best be ameliorated by our helping their parents and by their spending more time with their grandparents. Most children also benefit from less time in front of screens, more opportunities for self expression and play, and more ways to be active outdoors. Life is very pressured for children today, and many of them show signs of serious stress. One of the best ways to help children is to devise strategies that enable adults to make their lives calmer, simpler, less scheduled, and more fun. My first grandchild, Kate, was a baby when I was working on letters to a young therapist. Now she is 13, and I have four more grandchildren. I have found myself amazed and delighted by the kindness, sensitivity, and capacity for joy in children. Many a time after a difficult day, I've had the opportunity to rock the baby or play dominoes with the 6-year-old. These experiences rejuvenate me. I have also seen how difficult it is for parents to cope with all the demands of work, family, and the broader culture. We live in a family herding culture, and all good parents struggle with poisonous media, too much technology, a time famine, and consumerism. At this point in my career, I would spend more time praising parents for their efforts to build a strong family in spite of all the obstacles. I'd encourage them to have time together with their electronic devices off. Everyone in the family benefits from time outdoors, cooking together, making forays into farmers' markets or food forests, places where children can pick their own apples and pumpkins, raspberries and snow peas. As I have always done, I'd encourage parents to find a community of people to have dinner with once a week. This group can help them raise well adjusted children with wholesome paths to the future. If I were in practice today, I would make some changes in my own therapy style. For example, I would encourage clients to sit with me in silence for a moment at the beginning and end of each session. That would strengthen the protected time and space that is psychotherapy and give the client a little time to center and relax before we began our work. At the end of our time, this silence could help us both integrate the session at a deeper level. I might even encourage some clients to see me every other week and on the off week have a massage instead. I am aware of how much mental healthiness comes from a relaxed, pain free body. I have learned from experience the therapeutic benefit of simply lying down and looking at the sky. The night sky is especially therapeutic. Looking at the stars is a wonderful way to calm down, understand one's place in the scheme of things, and put the day's events into perspective. I find contact with the natural world even more healing than I did when I was younger. I often begin my days now by drinking a cup of coffee and watching the sunrise. The sound of a great horned owl or the sight of a fox can restore me. In the last few years, it has become more of a challenge to be both engaged with the world and calm and happy. I have found myself balancing my desire to be informed with my need for self protection. I am also aware that the healthiest psychological response to alarming information is action. For example, I think most humans are at some deep level stressed about global climate change. We are actually facing the loss of life on Earth as we know it, and this induces in us a primal panic. But we're so overwhelmed by the news and so unsure about what we can do to help that a common reaction to this information is denial, psychic numbing, or compartmentalization. I now make a mental health argument for activism. The brain functions best when it is hopeful. Acting as if we have hope generates hope. We may or may not succeed in averting tragic climate change, but at least we will avert our own surrender to despair. I also have come to understand what I call the transcendent response to trauma. When something too big for us to handle happens to us, our only healthy response is to grow bigger. We see that transcendent response all around us. Parents whose child is killed by a drunk driver devote the rest of their lives to creating safer streets. A father dying of cirrhosis becomes, for the first time in his life, a kind and engaged family member. Ordinary people, after a natural disaster, rise to the occasion and manage to survive by helping each other and growing spiritually. If I were in practice today, I would use this concept of the transcendent response to help my own clients with trauma. As therapists, our mission for our clients today is the same as it has been since Freud, Virginia Satir, Carl Rogers, and Abraham Maslow. We want them to be as intentional as possible in their choices and to be as kind, vibrant, authentic, and engaged with the world as they can be. Frank Pittman said that our work is helping people grow their souls. As we do this, we help our clients expand their moral imaginations and our own empathy and appreciation for different points of view grow. I hope this book helps you with the ordinary problems that come up in your work, and I would be most honored if you find that Letters to a Young Therapist enriches your sense of what a therapist can be. Our work is some of the most interesting and challenging work in the world. I am proud to have been a therapist, and I congratulate all of you who have decided to become therapists yourselves. I send all my best wishes as you proceed in our wonderful profession. Mary Pipher, Lincoln, Nebraska, September 2015. Introduction. In 1972, I saw my first therapy client, a young homeless woman from a brutal alcoholic family. Timidly and apologetically, Charlotte meandered into the free clinic at the university. Thereafter, in our weekly sessions, we struggled to make sense of her lonely, chaotic life. Charlotte would hang her head, her greasy bangs covering her eyes, as she whispered about rapes and beatings. She was so afraid of tenderness that, when I complimented her on even the smallest things, she winced. 6 months into therapy, Charlotte pushed her hair away from her eyes and looked me in the face. By the end of our first year together, she would smile when we met, and she even occasionally coughed out a tentative laugh. In the 3 years we worked together, I don't think I did her any harm. We liked and respected each other. No doubt I learned more from her than she learned from me. Since then, I have seen all kinds of people: hyperactive schoolboys, abused women, gifted students, gay dads, grieving widows, angry teenagers, adults who had committed various kinds of stupidity, psychopaths, people who were taking care of too many people, and families desperately trying to hold together or wrench apart. Over the last 30 years, I've watched a lot of pain flow under the bridge. By now, I have a PhD in human suffering. I've listened to many cautionary tales and seen the ways humans can hurt themselves and other people. I have learned vicariously what mistakes not to make. I have witnessed the train wrecks that follow extramarital affairs. I haven't had to gamble, use drugs, or keep secrets to realize that those behaviors are ultimately destructive. I have acquired a lifelong tuition-free education in the consequences of various choices. During most of my years in clinical practice, I worked 6 blocks from home with my husband Jim and my good friend Jan. We created a small is beautiful office. Our kids cleaned it until they left home, and then we cleaned it ourselves. We did our own billing and scheduled our own appointments. Once, a high-powered psychiatrist said to me, "I'll have my people call your people." I had to confess, I have no people. Over the decades, the work changed a great deal. New theories marched to center stage, then exited quietly. We therapists frothed our way through the ditzy 70s and almost destroyed ourselves in the 80s, the era of recovered memory work. We traveled from endless unstructured sessions to goal-focused short-term therapy. Family therapy, once our finest technique, has almost vanished. And yet, like Homer's wine-dark sea, therapy is always changing, always the same. I love the work. Sometimes people ask if it is depressing to spend all day listening to problems. I tell them, I'm not listening to problems, I am listening for solutions. Clients generally arrive when they want to make changes. They are paying for advice and are ready to listen. As a therapist, my experience is that unhappy clients become happier, that feuding couples start to enjoy each other, and that families settle down and work together. Not always, but usually, after a few sessions, I begin to hear stories of victories. In therapy, as in life, point of view is everything. As a therapist, I am slightly detached from my clients' problems. I try to keep my eyes on the prize, which, while tailored for each client, is essentially the same. I want people to leave feeling calmer, kinder, and more optimistic. I want them to be more intentional in their choices, and in many cases, less impulsive in their appetites. Robert Frost wrote, "Education elevates trouble to a higher plane." So does psychotherapy. It is a way of exploring pain and confusion to produce meaning and hope. This book consists of lessons I've learned from the people who have tromped into my office and flopped down on my old couch for conversations. It distills what I have learned from hundreds of hours of listening to people answering the question, "What brings you in today?" Along with having sex, sleeping, and sharing food, conversation is arguably one of the most basic of all human behaviors. Two or more people tell each other stories. They struggle to solve the problems of their day and to laugh and calm down. Freud structured these conversations in a new way, and academics eventually conducted research on these particular conversations, but in the end, therapy consists of people talking things over. It is complicated work. Mark Twain described himself as all of humanity crammed into a suit of clothes. Everyone who walks into our office contains all the rest of us, and yet we all run from our humanity. We prevaricate and puff ourselves up. We fear admitting how vulnerable we feel. We try to hide our flaws. Over and over again, we have to learn how to simply be human. In my case, I'm what a friend once described as a clumsy brainiac. My mother joked I could write essays before I could walk. I'm blind in one eye, moody, unfashionable, directionally impaired, claustrophobic, and easily tuckered out, and those flaws are just the ones I'll confess to. But somehow I found a few people to love me, and I know their flaws and love them too. In fact, they are my close friends and family, the people I love the most. As a therapist, I see myself as a generalist, the psychologist equivalent of my mother, who was a general practitioner of medicine. I'm not a good play therapist. I treat young children by helping their parents figure out how to deal with them. I avoid legal work and sophisticated diagnostics. Specialization offers financial and professional rewards, but to me, specialization has always sounded dull. 30 years is a long time to solve one kind of problem. For me, the best trick is not to have tricks. When I attempt to be clever or sophisticated, I often confuse myself as well as my clients. Once when I suggested what I thought was a brilliant, rather mysterious homework assignment, my client asked me if I was on drugs. Another time when I predicted the future in an attempt to generate a self-fulfilling prophecy, my hard-drinking client looked at me in the eyes and said bluntly, "If you can predict the future, you ought to go to Vegas." For the most part, my solutions to human problems have been simple ones. Get more rest, do good work, take things a day at a time, and find some people to love. Of course, simple suggestions aren't necessarily easy and they don't always work. When they don't, I generally fall back on my belief in the process of therapy. Albert Einstein said, "A problem cannot be solved by the consciousness that created it." Therapy gives clients a safe relationship in which to explore their inner world and to consider taking risks in their external one. It provides them with another point of view on their own particular mixed-up universe. As a student, I studied Carl Jung, Harry Sullivan, Otto Rank, Fritz Perls, and George Kelly. I read Freud, but I never much liked the idea that all good behavior was sublimation. I resisted his view that life was mostly competition, aggression, and sex, a very male theory. I was always attracted to growth and strength-based models. I respected the humanists and the existentialists, Abe Maslow, Rollo May, Viktor Frankl, and Carl Rogers. I was intrigued by Carol Gilligan's and the Stone Center's ideas about the self in relationship to others. Even before positive psychology existed, I believed in the importance of focusing on good news. When I began my training in 1972, psychologists were mainly testers. I learned to administer intelligence tests, personality inventories, and projectives in which clients were shown indistinct stimuli, such as ink blots, and asked to report on what they saw. At first, I was fascinated by all those tests, but with experience, I grew to prefer conversations as a diagnostic method. I interned at the University of Texas Medical Center, which at that time had several pioneers of family therapy employed. I relished the liveliness of family therapy. Later at the University of Nebraska, I taught one of the first Psychology of Women courses. In some ways, I've swum in the mainstream, but I've also paddled alone. I had strong biases against family bashing, cutoffs, and blaming people who were not in the room to defend themselves. I urged clients to go home for holidays and attend family reunions. I never used the term dysfunctional family or recommended that anyone sue his own parents. Even as a little girl, I felt protective of my own quirky family. I experienced my mother and father as rather incompetent, unavailable parents with many complicated problems of their own, but I also experienced them as loving me and doing their best. Much of my internal landscape comes from my conversations with them. I don't judge them harshly for their mistakes, and I don't feel inclined to judge others too harshly either. Perhaps because of my training in anthropology, I have always viewed mental health problems as related to the broader environment. Depression, anxiety, domestic violence, and drug and alcohol abuse, not to mention hyperactive children and eating disorders, arise from our deeply dysfunctional culture. Who can be healthy in a culture in which children watch movies about hookers and serial killers? How can we expect people to be happy when they don't know their neighbors, see their extended families, or have time for naps on Sunday afternoons? As a culture, we are mired deep in denial about our effects on others, on the earth, and on generations to come. We ignore the problems of children, refugees, the aged, and the poor. Our media encourages us to live at a surface level, to think about window treatments instead of world peace or our own spiritual needs. We are educated to be compartmentalized. Our culture makes us sick physically and emotionally. Good therapy gently but firmly moves people out of denial and compartmentalization. It helps clients develop richer inner lives and greater self-knowledge. It teaches clients to live harmoniously with others, and it enhances existential consciousness and allows people to take responsibility for their effects on the world at large. For me, happiness is about appreciating what one has. Practically speaking, this means lowering expectations about what is fair, possible, and likely. It means finding pleasure in the ordinary. I'm not a television watcher or shopper, and as best I can, I steer people away from the idea that happiness is connected to having more, and more. To be an adult means to accept the awesome responsibility of constantly making choices. I believe that after a certain age, with the exception of the chronically mentally ill and the profoundly mentally challenged, we are responsible for our own lives. It's patronizing and contemptuous to believe otherwise. I encourage clients to understand and accept the past with all its complexity. Then I urge them to move on to create something beautiful for themselves and others. We all have our sorrows, but they don't exempt us from our duties. I opened my private practice in 1979, and most of my practice took place during the golden age when therapists had plenty of time to help clients. Most people carried good insurance coverage for therapy, and even factory workers could come in for extended periods and explore their issues at a leisurely pace. Therapists weren't expected to produce rapid, concrete changes. When managed care slammed into our state, I ignored it. I had enjoyed too many years of doing things my own way. I couldn't tolerate outsiders calling the shots with my clients. Recently, I met a busy therapist who bragged his therapy was all killer, no filler. He claimed he could treat most people in 4 sessions. I could barely conceal my skepticism. Good therapy, like good cooking, takes time. Of course, some clients and therapists abused the old system, but most of us used our time wisely. In the past, we could develop strong relationships with our clients. Now, in the crunch to save time and money, therapists must work fast and demonstrate weekly progress. Much is lost in the process. Over the years, I worked for the University of Nebraska as a clinical supervisor for graduate students in psychology. Sometimes I drove to the university and sat in on sessions or watched my students work from behind a one-way mirror. Often the students carried their tapes of therapy to my home. We played them on my VCR, and I offered tips and sympathy. I have written this book in the form of letters to Laura, who was my favorite graduate student. Laura was in her 20s and single. She was open-minded, warm-hearted, and deeply in love with psychology. Like me, she was an outdoors person. Unlike me, she was a risk-taker who liked canoeing, rollerblading, and rock climbing. Like most young therapists, Laura was a funny mix of scared and overconfident. She wanted to sample every kind of client, but she was easily overwhelmed. I hope both therapists and general readers relish these letters. I offer plenty of clinical examples from my own work. I save quotations, and I can't resist throwing in some of my favorites. I try to avoid popular psychology lingo and social science jargon, and yet I want to gently remind readers that in these harsh times, Therapy can be a solution. I wrote these letters in the early morning. My desk overlooks an old maple tree, my flower garden, and bird and squirrel feeding stations. The letters were a year-long project, and the seasons influenced my moods and my writing. The reader may enjoy analyzing me for seasonal affective disorder. I began writing these letters on December 2nd, 2001, a bitterly cold day in Nebraska. We were just about to put to bed the year that included September 11th. All of us were hopeful that the new year might bring better tidings, but it was a dark time for the world. For me, these letters were a kind of vacation. They gave me an opportunity to focus on human-sized issues rather than global events. Dear reader, I hope you find these letters both educational and fun. Indeed, one of the things I have observed as a therapist is that fun is by no means trivial. It's one of the best things we have. So settle yourself into a comfortable spot in the sunlight or by a fire. Make some peach tea and find a cat for your lap. Let's visit.